Episode 2 opens with the aftermath of the murder of Aegon's son. You can imagine this is now picking up just shortly after the boy had been killed. His mother, the queen, having raised the alarm to Alicent and Sir Christian Cole. And when the episode opens, you see the various, let's say, staff members of the castle or the Red Keep running about. A lot of activity and whatnot. We can presume that they are looking for the person that, or persons that committed this atrocity. And when you think about it, it actually reminds me a bit of, in the first season, that would have been episode 9, where, episode 8 or 9, I think it would have been episode 9, where Viserys dies and they crown Aegon king. Where when the news first starts spreading that Viserys has died, that they try to keep it a bit quiet. And as part of that is that they initially keep Rhaenys locked up in her room. One of the guards comes and frees her, kind of guiding her through the streets to safety, out of the Red Keep into safety. I think like they're trying to get to a ship or something like that. And when they make it out into the street, she's separated from this guard and gets swept up in the crowd of people who are pushing towards what turns out to be Aegon's coronation. And seeing that, and then seeing, like the various people running about here, it kind of reminded me, the two scenes reminded me of each other. And even here, where you have, we'll get into this in a moment, the funeral procession, this mad crush of people milling about, where it's like these moments of high and low, where in the previous season, when it was a matter of Aegon being crowned king, you had this crush of people, this crowd of people, but that was for, at least for Team Green, a joyous occasion. And here you have it now, where it's like the flip side of that, this mad crush of people, but it's for a very somber occasion, the death of this child, the death of Aegon's heir. As is to be expected, we see Alicent is crying, everyone's sort of responding to this news in their own way. And it plays out for quite a bit of the episode, where we touch base with the various characters and see their response, how they're taking the news. Where we see Alicent, that she is still very shaken up by this, because, of course, putting aside everything with Rhaenyra and her sons and, they're plotting and scheming and whatnot, this is her grandson that has been murdered, right? This is the queen's son that has been murdered. Aegon's son that has been murdered. And so we see her in shock and highly upset about the death of this little boy. We see his mother, as to be expected, shocked and upset about the death of this little boy. And I wasn't surprised by Aegon's response, but given the climate and the tensions in the air, it's what I pointed to with the first episode, that this tit for tat, which has already turned deadly, is just going to continue on. Where you can go back as far as, Aemon losing his eye and Alicent being out for blood at that point, but Viserys being present and having enough pull, really, or at least trying, because Alicent still pushes for trying to take one of Rhaenyra's son's eyes, right? But you see, Viserys was smart in that moment, where instead of having this thing of retribution, that wrong was done here, but let's put an end to it here, let's let this matter drop here, and call it even, because otherwise it's just going to continue to spiral, right? if he allowed Alicent to blind one of Rhaenyra's sons, then the tit for tat would just continue. Unfortunately, while that situation was more so put on pause, it came back up later on to deadly effect, right? Between Aemond and Lucerys, where Aemond might not have intended to kill Lucerys, but him setting off after Lucerys on his dragon kind of set things in motion. And from there, you have Lucerys then dies, Rhaenyra wants revenge, Daemon takes it upon himself to get involved, and this little boy ends up dying. And I thought it was actually pretty interesting, the conversation between Alicent and Hightower, where you can tell she's feeling some guilt and some remorse. And for the first time, I actually feel maybe a little bit sympathetic, empathetic, whichever one is the proper term in this circumstance, towards her, where of the people involved, she seems to be the only one who truly has any kind of remorse. And it's like, when you think about it, she's been a part of the wrongdoing, but not quite as willing to take things as far as the people around her. You know, like, there's still some little bit of a moral compass there, where if you think back to it, that never mind what might have passed between them, that she mourned the loss of Rhaenyra's son. That here she mourns the loss of her grandson, the loss of her son's son, but at the same time doesn't really jump to conclusions. You know, like, her first thing is to question, well, maybe with the wrong that we've done, with the wrong that she's done, this is like the gods punishing them. Which is her playing a hand in, you know, Hightower coming back as Hand of the King and the various machinations with Viserys and put her son on the throne, where, you know, they refer to Rhaenyra as being a pretender to the throne, but the reality is that part of the guilt that she might be feeling is that, you know, some of this might be a result of her and her dad really angling, scheming, and conniving to get her son onto the throne when he realistically didn't belong there. And so the guilt of it is that with them putting her son on the throne, you know, this tragedy has befallen her grandson. At the same time, you have where Aegon is besides himself, enraged really at the death of his son. And it's to be expected, but it's like this thing of that words matter, right? Where as he's yelling and throwing stuff about, there's like a few things there that I thought were pretty interesting, right? Kind of symbolic, where he is ranting and raving in, I would refer to it as Viserys' chamber. It still looks like the same room. It's this room with the miniature of King's Landing. And I found it quite telling that in his rage, he has some kind of I don't know if it's a stick or a club or whatever it is, but whatever he has in his hand, for some reason I thought it was a golf club, but I'm pretty sure it was not. This object that he has in his hands, he takes and he starts beating away at King's Landing, like just destroying the city. And you think about it, that's actually quite symbolic, where we can assume a lot of these things that have taken place has been a result of anger, right? This desire for revenge. Here it is that he's lost his son. He is the king. This is a miniature of King's Landing. But he has the power as king to really wreak havoc. And it's like, you look at it, this back and forth, what has kind of held everyone at check, held everyone at bay so far from going full throttle, has been the preservation of King's Landing, right? Or at least that was Rhaenyra's reasoning, that it didn't make sense to unleash dragons on King's Landing because you would burn up the place and then you'd have a mess of a city to deal with afterwards. And I found it quite telling that in his fit of rage, that he takes this blunt object and destroys King's Landing. And the reality is that's what's about to happen, where, he's calling for revenge, and it's like a continuation of this back and forth between his side and Team Black, where it's like, in their anger, in their quest for revenge, in their quest for retribution, and trying to get control of the Iron Throne, that they are going to destroy King's Landing. And I found like the symbolism to be quite, like, it was a nice touch, that his way of raging, like, he doesn't like kick a puppy or something like that, which would be bad. Instead, he takes this club-like object or whatever and goes and destroys the miniature of King's Landing. It's like, of all the things he could have destroyed, he could have, destroyed the nursery that the kids were in. Or he could have, carried on in the throne room or something like that. But instead, he's placed in this room with this miniature of King's Landing, and that's what he destroys. You can think of it as foreshadowing of what's to come. That this is like the calm before the storm. And here you have it where he meets with the rest of Team Green in this like meeting chamber that they have. And in his rage and grief, basically he wants revenge against Rhaenyra, right? Like, just automatically jumps to conclusions that she's responsible for this, and Alicent isn't quite prepared to make that leap, right? They don't actually have any proof. It would seem like the most logical person, but the rest of Team Green, they're not quite ready to make that leap. Yet, Hightower sees this as a good opportunity to get like some good PR for Team Green, right? Or rather generate some bad PR for Team Black. And this was something that I pointed to in the previous episode, where sure, you might be at war, your two sides are fighting and whatnot, but I think most people would look at you with displeasure, or you would be regarded as a coward, really, for killing a small child in their bed. Right? It's not like you faced off against some big warrior and defeated them or something like that. Or even like, you killed the king or whatever. Like, he's fair game. But in killing this child, the optics of it looks terrible. It makes Rhaenyra look like a really terrible person. And like I said, I felt that in committing this act as a matter of honor, some people who might have sided with her might now be convinced that, she is devoid of character, she's a terrible person. We don't want to stand beside her. We don't want to align ourselves with her. And with that, they might, if not remain neutral in the situation, they might even move over to Team Green. And I thought it was actually pretty smart on Hightower's part to recognize this for the opportunity that it is. Now, I am Team Black, but I thought it was smart for Team Green to kind of capitalize on this tragedy too. It's like, you might as well, right? Like, the kid isn't coming back. But them trying to capitalize on this tragedy to win people over to their side, right? Like, kind of fighting this battle out in the court of public opinion. And I thought like those little touches I like them. I like that kind of depth and this onion type storytelling where it's like, you have things going on at different levels. And you have where they're now setting up this big public procession to really make a big display of it and really to call attention to Rhaenyra and her supposedly problematic character. And Larys comes into this meeting room and explains to Aegon and company that they've captured one of the assailants, that he was trying to flee the city with the child's head in a bag. And, initially the response, I believe Aegon's response is to just kill this guy, like to torture him and just murder him. But instead, I think it's like Hightower who speaks up and says, because Aegon just assumes that it's Rhaenyra that's set forth the orders and put this into play to kill this kid. But the others kind of talk him down to not jump the gun and to, instead of just killing this guy outright, to question him and see what information could be obtained. It's like they're actually making like some pretty smart calls on their part. Not so much on Team Black. Team Black is looking kind of bad right now. As we shift over to Dragonstone, and you realize like it's bedlam over there, right? The concerns that I had last episode about loyalty, Daemon's inability to follow orders, Daemon being hot-headed, being ill-tempered and whatnot, that in the long run it was just going to create problems. And, word arrives at Dragonstone that the boy has been killed, and they're taken aback by it. Right? Rhaenyra states, well, she knows she didn't have anything to do with it. She didn't know anything about it, and she's actually appalled by it. And you look over, the camera shifts to Daemon, and he's like kind of smirking to himself. And it's like, what normal person would be sitting there smiling about something like this? And with that, Rhaenyra realizes that he likely had something to do with the death of this boy. And so immediately you have like this cutaway to the two of them now by themselves arguing over the death of this child, where Daemon has once again taken steps on his own, kind of in his own way usurping Rhaenyra's power and authority to do his own thing, not consulting with her. But yet here it is, like I said, what happened, where he set this thing into motion, but people aren't going to blame him. They're going to blame Rhaenyra. I actually found it quite fitting that despite the death of her own son, that she is still able to recognize how truly atrocious it is to have killed this child. That never mind the death of her son, that her plan, her plot, her scheme was to get to Aemond. That's who killed her son. That's who she had problems with. That's who she wanted to deal with. How you make the leap from killing Aemond or trying to kill Aemond and let's say failing because you haven't found him, to just killing anyone that's, a high tower on that side is just quite the leap. Quite the leap. The war hasn't even gotten underway, but yet there's already problems between these two. And at the center of it is, as Rhaenyra points out, is sure, they've allied themselves, they've married and whatnot, and at this point they've been together for some time. But the reality is that Daemon is working and operating in service to and for Daemon. And so he'll do like and as she points out here, like they make some really good observations about things that took place in the first season where there's this darkness within Daemon. There's this desperation within him to make a name for himself, to kind of stake his claim and to show his spot or to claim his spot in the world. And as Rhaenyra points out, this very same drive, this lack of forethought and planning, and this tendency to rush into things is what got him moved aside as heir. And in response, which was a comment that I made from the first season, that Viserys didn't necessarily select Rhaenyra because of some great admiration for her or some great desire to have her be queen. He really at least initially put her in place as a way of spiting Daemon, as a way of moving him aside. And like just these little things that they touch on and whatnot, I was very, very impressed. And I will give myself a pat on the back because I think I made some really good calls with predicting how things would unfold. And so now here it is that you have where Daemon has put Rhaenyra in a really, really tough place. Now, I will say that I found it a little bit questionable that following her disagreement with Daemon, that Rhaenyra calls for his daughter and sends her off to patrol and keep an eye on King's Landing to kind of figure out what their next steps, what Team Black's next steps were going to be. Because that is like that's like the main stronghold of the enemy, right? It's dangerous to patrol that area and also actually quite important. So one would wonder, why not send Jaehaerys, or someone else? Why specifically Daemon's daughter? Sir Christian Cole is moving through the castle and he ends up at the nursery, where it's actually quite sad to see them dismantling this room, taking apart like the little kiddie beds and whatnot. Because you see Sir Christian Cole standing there and looking on, and you can see the workers like dismantling the room. And then it gets to this point where there's like this little mattress that one of the workers picks up, and like part of it is just covered with blood, and you can imagine that's where the child was killed. And again, you have this juxtaposition where not just between this episode, but previous episodes, and even between the two sides here, where you have like the flip side of situations, right? Where in King's Landing, the king's son has been murdered, and we see the nursery being taken apart, where all of the things that, like the children's beds, their toys and all of that are being cleared out of this room. And then on the flip side of it, we then immediately see Rhaenyra sitting in her children's nursery with what we could presume is like her two youngest children, playing with them, watching them play. So it's sort of like the flip side of this coin, where on the one side you have this tremendous loss that has taken place, and on the other side of it you have it where, Rhaenyra, just a few episodes ago, she lost her son, but here it is that she has these two younger children. It doesn't replace it, doesn't make up for it, but rather just the juxtaposition of it, where you have this tremendous loss on one side and the taking apart of that nursery. And then here on Dragonstone, you have where Rhaenyra's youngest children are still alive and you see her playing with her kids. I like how in telling the story, you have like this reflection, sort of like if you think of a funhouse mirror type reflection, where you have two similar situations taking place, but there's some distortion in it. So you have, obviously Rhaenyra is thinking about what is to come as a result of this child being murdered, but here it is that for the time being, she's here with her children, playing with them. And then over in King's Landing, you have it where the nursery has become this dreadful place because of what took place there.
Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, go ahead and click the thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.